Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20. And here today, our magical misery tour continues. In recent lectures, we've examined imperialism, the systemic effort to deny millions of people around the globe independence and self-determination. That was followed by World War I, a bloody revolution in Russia, and most recently, a debilitating global depression that would scar the lives of millions of people around the globe. Here today, we continue this theme of happy-go-lucky stories from the 20th century with now the rise of fascism, and we will use as a case study the rise of fascism in Germany. In examining the rise of fascism in Germany, we'll see yet another radical transformation where an existing order is toppled and replaced by a new radical regime. We've already seen that in the story of the transformation in Russia, the Russian Revolution. Now we will see such a change, albeit in a very different way with a very different methodology and ideology in Germany. And so at the end of this lecture, we'll spend a few moments comparing and contrasting those radical transformations. One, the Russian Revolution, and here today, the rise of fascism, just in case somebody may ask you about that on an exam coming soon. So here we turn our attention to another terrible, tragic story of the 20th century, the rise of fascism in Germany, yet another radical transformation here in the early 20th century. We begin this case study analysis of the rise of fascism in Germany. We begin this exploration of this radical transformation, the rise of Nazism in Germany, with some understanding of why Germany was so ripe for radical change, just as we did with Russia in explaining why it was ripe for radical transformation in the form of the Bolshevik Revolution. Here we explain why Germany was in many ways poised for radical change. You had the sense of wounded national pride that came with the epic failure of World War I. Now, everybody loses World War I. Nobody wins World War I. World War I is this calamitous event in early 20th century history that hopefully at this point you've already seen has so much in terms of terrible consequences. But the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I officially declared that Germany was defeated and the sole responsible agent for a war that was everyone's fault. With it came a loss of Germany's colonies around the globe. And colonies were part of a way of building national pride and prominence. Germany lost a great deal of land. A lot of the new nations formed at the end of the Paris Peace Conference came out of land carved out of both the Russian and German empires. So Germany lost a great deal of land, lost its colonies around the globe. It had to radically downscale its military. It had to pay ruinous reparations each year to the official winning side of World War I, France and Great Britain. And in a moment, we'll talk about how that was instrumentally debilitating to the German economy, but it was also symbolic that the defeat continued in these annual payments. World War I began in part because of a sense of nationalism, national greatness, the national rivalries as these modern nation states developed and built up these big bitchin' militaries. And so to see that national pride so instrumental to the road to World War I, that long fuse, to see that sense of national pride assailed, decimated by the defeat and the terrible, ruinous nature of the war was particularly psychologically traumatizing to German people. If you believe in something, if you believe in this ideal of nationalism, that the German nation is special, unique, that it's not like these other nations, and you march forward into war with that belief, to have that belief contradicted is very, very debilitating, and it urges people to look for either a new source of direction, meaning in their lives, or something that will rationalize and rehabilitate that national pride. So Germany's experience at the end of World War I, Germany's experience at the Paris Peace Conference and its aftermath, very crucial to building a sense of malaise, misery, despair, defeatedness in the German people, and a craving for something to revitalize their spirits or provide a new sense of direction. That is the psychological damage that came with the aftermath of World War I, and then there's the economic damage. Germany would be hit hard by the Great Depression, but it never had that preliminary period of seemingly rebounded economic opportunity that you see in places like the United States with the Roaring '20s and the way in which the British economy rebounded by the mid to late '20s. Instead, Germany experienced a very long depression that began really in the aftermath of World War I, with the effects of World War I on German society, scarcity leading to inflation, destruction to the physical structure and infrastructure of the nation. And so World War I did great damage to the German economy, but then on top of that, you had reparations. You had this obligation of the German government to spend millions of dollars to support Germany's enemies of France and Great Britain. And that led to a depression that began in the 1920s. So Germany was denied what other industrial nations at least enjoyed prior to the late 20s, 1930s, the global depression we described in our recent lecture. It was denied that brief period of prosperity that for some restored faith in capitalism. Instead, the 20s and 30s was an absolute period of economic disaster for Germany. And this only amplified, again, the sense of malaise, despair that came with the experience of World War I, the aftermath of World War I. Now, on top of that, you can't find work. You are struggling to feed your family. There's this deep sense of despair that comes with that. So the economic collapse is also key here to urging people in Germany to look for some source of hope, some source of revitalization, some way of putting people back to work and restoring faith, not just in the German nation, but in these bare concerns about one's existence, one's ability to eat, one's ability to see hope in the future economically. Bread, land, and peace. Remember, a lot of that had to do with economic revitalization or restoring hope to people who felt they had no hope. In a different context, when the Nazis come along and say, we'll put people to work, well, that, again, is a very tangible source of hope and change amidst a nation that had been rocked by 2 decades of economic despair. At the Paris Peace Conference, there was this effort to create a new Germany, to replace the autocratic rule of the Kaiser with a liberal government. And that led to the creation of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was the government set up after World War I in Germany. This was done in concert between German officials and British and French diplomats who wanted to, again, make sure Germany could never be a threat to France and Great Britain. That was the driving impulse behind France and Great Britain's efforts to punish Germany, to make sure Germany would never be a threat again. And as part of that, they wanted to set up a government in Germany that was, in their mind, these British and French officials, disinclined towards war. And so they wanted to create a liberal republic with a liberal constitution and a liberal form of governance, a parliament, an executive branch, and a government that was largely run by industrialists and key power brokers in Germany. And so that created the Weimar Republic, which is the liberal government that replaced the autocratic rule of the Kaiser. When Germany emerges as a liberal state in the 19th century, it involved a sort of marriage between traditional roles played by an autocrat, a Kaiser, and this growing bureaucratic and industrial class. Well, at the end of World War I, that industrial bureaucratic class consolidates with foreigners to create the Weimar Republic, again with the idea that, well, we will end the proclivity of Germany towards war with its neighbors by creating a government, a liberal government, that's more interested in advancing industrialization and the goals of the elites in charge of that particular new form of governance, the Weimar Republic. Well, there are a number of problems here. One, this is an indication to German people that they are being denied independence, sovereignty, that once again they are subject to the punishment, abuses of foreigners, British and French meddling in their affairs. Here's an imposition on the German people. This is not a legitimate government. It was created by foreigners for their interest and ends. Furthermore, the Weimar Republic did really unpopular things, like continued to pay reparations even during a debilitating depression. And so it was associated with these failed policies. It was associated with the economics collapse. And it was associated with that lingering punishment and misery associated with, in the minds of the German people, the injustice of the Paris Peace Conference. So the Weimar Republic was doomed from the beginning. It was imposed by outsiders. It wasn't organic. It didn't come from within. And one of the lessons to take away from this class is that governments really only have legitimacy if they are, again, organic. They cannot be grafted onto people from afar. They cannot be imposed upon people without their will. You can use force, you can use coercive power to maintain your control, but that's not a government with legitimacy. That's a government with more bullets and more people. A legitimate government has to enjoy the consent of the governed. And we'll see many instances where there's this effort to impose upon people a government. We've talked about what's happening in Southwest Asia and the Middle East after World War I with the system established by the British and the French, protectorates and mandates, basically colonies in a different name, where again the people of that region are denied sovereignty and independence. They are subject to the whims and directions of outsiders. And so we've already seen, we'll continue to see, when you try to impose a government on people, if you try to say, hey, here's your government, you'll love it, it's great, we designed it for you, it's not going to work. If you try to impose a government on people, you might be able to get away with that for a while through power, through coercive force, but you'll never be seen as legitimate. Legitimate governments have to be grown from within. They have to develop in a really messy, complicated, incomplete way, but in organic fashion. That's not what's happening here in Germany. The Weimar Republic was an imposition imposed upon the German people with the interest of foreigners first and foremost. And so it was doomed to fail. And then it was associated with all these terrible contextual factors in Germany, a terrible economy, the loss of national pride. And so the Weimar Republic was in many ways doomed. And when people are angry, when people are despondent, when people are starving, when they feel as if they have no hope, and the people who are in charge, the people who are there to offer a remedy, are seen as unresponsive, illegitimate, not reflective of the will of the people, well, again, you have a context ripe for radical change. There's a sense in Germany that the guys in charge don't deserve to be in charge. They don't represent us. They are imposed upon us. And that creates a context for radical change. Remember, in a very different context, we saw this sense in Russia that the people in charge don't listen, the people in charge don't care, the people in charge are out of our reach, meaning we can't influence them. They're unresponsive. And when you feel as if nobody hears you and there's no means, legitimate means of change, well, that urges people to go for extra legal, outside the system methods of change. That's why you get radical revolutions. If you feel as if the system is corrupt, the system doesn't work, the system is unresponsive, well, the problem is the system. The problem is the existing order, and it must be toppled. And the Weimar Republic suffered from that sense of illegitimacy. Then, it's important here to note that the rise of fascism in Germany plays out after the Russian Revolution. So we're making lots of comparisons here because we want to understand, why does this happen? Why does an existing order collapse and a new radical order replace it? Why do you see these violent transformations in places like Russia and Germany in the first half of the 20th century? Well, it's important that we make these comparisons and see the overlap between what's going on in Russia and what's going on in Germany, but it's also important as historians to understand the lineage, the chronological history, because as we'll see in this lecture, the radical transformation in Germany, the rise of fascism in Germany, played out in a context where the Russian Revolution had already taken place, and again, it now existed, the Soviet state, as a model, as an alternative way of organizing society. As we talked about in our recent lecture, there is a growing sense in Germany and around the world, particularly in the industrialized world, after the Russian Revolution, that if it could happen there, it could happen here. There are true believers who believe in a Marxist way of thinking about human history that argues this is inevitable, that the contradictions, disparities that capitalism creates will eventually lead to an overthrow of the system. And there are communists in Germany, as well as, of course, nations around the world who believe this. So the radical transformation we are explaining in this lecture, the rise of fascism in Germany, begins in the 20s and 30s after the Russian Revolution, where the largest country on earth has undergone this shift, where the Tsar and his family have been executed. Lenin is now at the head of the Soviet state. And because of that, there's this fear that if it could happen there, it could happen here. There is this advocacy by true believers who say Germany should be next and we should overthrow these capitalists and industrialists and create a communist paradise here in Germany. And as we will see here, that real perceived threat of communist revolution will urge many people to say, I don't really like these Nazis, but I prefer them to the communists, or I really like these Nazis because they're going to keep us safe from a communist revolution. As we will talk about in this lecture, the Nazis came to power in part because they promised the German people that they would save the Republic from a communist revolution, that it won't happen here, that you should turn to us because we will stamp out the communists. We will round them up and kill them, literally, to prevent a communist takeover. And as we'll talk about here, that will urge a lot of industrialists and bankers and wealthy people in Germany to cast their lot with Hitler. So Nazism in Germany was anti-communist. It was opposed to communism, to the democratic arguments that we've seen develop in the 19th century and then manifest in revolutions, first in Russia, and again, more to come. This idea of an overthrow of the elites, the industrialists, the wealthy, the bankers by the proletariat. That's the ideology of communism. And Nazism was created as not just an alternative to communism, but a safeguard from a communist revolution. So there's a lot of overlap, a lot of commonalities here between the radical revolution in Russia and the radical transformation that comes with the rise of Nazism in Germany. But also be mindful that what's taking place in Germany is taking place after a successful communist revolution in Russia. And as I've stressed now, you have first an alternative out there, another way of organizing humanity, communism. And you have, therefore, a model to inspire some or a threat to inflame the fear and concerns of others. And Nazism comes along and says, we'll get rid of communism, turn to us instead. And so it has that appeal to certain segments of the German society, as we'll see here. So all of this really helps explain why Germany is ripe for radical change and the appeal for some of a radical transformation in the form of Nazism. The defeat and trauma of World War I, economic disaster where people are unemployed and starving, a sense that the system as it exists is illegitimate, unresponsive, and there's no way to salvage it that you need to radically overthrow the government because the government is either corrupt or illegitimate. You have a fear that if we don't lead the revolution, they will, the communists will. And you have a deep psychological malaise that's harder to quantify, measure, but it's certainly very, very palpable in Germany. We've talked about that sense of a lost utopia, a sense that the promise and hopes of the century had faded. We talked about the trauma that came with people who are deeply invested in national pride and prestige having that belief compromised. We talked about this yearning for some source of meaning and direction. And in radical transformations, in radical movements, you have the allure of being part of something, being part of a community. You have the allure of doing something. And we'll talk a lot about how fascism in particular stressed action, being aggressive, taking action. Don't think, don't wait. That's bad. That's weak. That's associated with the enemy. And so there's this sort of psychological appeal of fascism. There's this appeal of being part of something. It's identity. It's a movement. And sometimes that identity for people who are scarred, miserable, feeling adrift in a vast sea without a source of meaning and direction, that appeal of action speaks to people. And it doesn't really matter what the ideas are, the goals are. It's that experience of being part of something that certainly appealed to people in Germany who were psychologically scarred by the events of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So we begin with the summary of why this could happen in Germany. And then into that context comes the Nazi Party, which offered itself as the solution to the various problems plaguing Germany and the way forward. The Nazi Party was founded shortly after World War I by many angry veterans of the Great War, including Adolf Hitler. It was officially named the National Socialist German Workers' Party when first founded, and eventually will be simply the Nazi Party. Let's deal with this issue now because it continues on, sadly, tragically, in our era of misinformation floating along in the sewer of the internet. The Nazis were not socialists. There are some media figures on the right today who have made a pretty lucrative career out of making this argument that Nazis were socialists and that socialism is somehow the same as Nazism and fascism. And the very compelling, rigorous evidence that they cite is, whoa, just look at the name, it says National Socialist. There you go, case closed, right? The Nazis were not socialists. They were not socialists in the way that we've described in this class, coming out of that critique of capitalism. By no means were the Nazis socialists as an ideological movement. In fact, they hated socialists, and they will round up and kill socialists. They will declare socialists enemies of the state. So do not confuse this one word in the name, the first name of the party as it was founded after World War I, with the ideology or political system of socialism. The Nazis hated socialists, and they stylized themselves as not only an alternative to socialism, but an enemy of socialism. In their early formation, they were trying to appeal to the masses, and we'll talk about how they offered themselves as a remedy to the ills and miseries of the German population. And there was a developing socialist and communist movement in Germany that was reaching out and building support among the many disgruntled, unemployed Germans. And so the Nazis added this to their name because they wanted to stylize themselves as a popular movement. They wanted to outcompete socialist parties in the chaos of the early Weimar Republic. But ideologically, they weren't socialists, and in practice, they were not socialists. Whatever rhetoric you might find in early Nazi leadership that seems to be a critique of capitalism or an argument from a leftist point of view about the inequities of wealth and power really is rooted instead not in socialism or communism or Marxism, but in the true ideology of Nazism, anti-Semitism. That's the real ideological basis for Nazism, hatred of the Jewish people. And so many early figures in the Nazi movement would offer critiques of bankers, of people who exact demands of high interest, capitalists, but they tended to make those arguments as part of their ideology of anti-Semitism, blaming the Jewish people for the misery of the German nation. So you can find in some quarters of the Nazi Party some rhetoric that sounds a lot like anti-capitalist rhetoric, but it's really anti-Semitic rhetoric. It's about targeting bankers and financiers because of their religion and identifying them as enemies. It is not a movement of the proletariat. It's not a movement of the underclass. It's not a movement to topple the industrial class. As we'll see, industrialists were active supporters of Nazism. So don't fall for the sloppy and deliberately deceptive arguments you sometimes hear again on that sewer of misinformation, the internet. Nazis were not socialists. Instead, they were strongly patriotic. They argued that Germany is a great nation. It is a nation that is inherently superior to others. And the only reason why we lost World War I or failed to conquer all of Europe was that we were betrayed by our leaders and also saboteurs and disloyal people within. Nazism, the Nazi Party, developed through an appeal to the forces of inclusion-exclusion. It fanned the flames of patriotic fervor by speaking about a German Volk, a German population, a German people who are inherently superior, who are inherently strong, mighty, and destined to take over all of Europe and the world. They failed in their efforts to do that in World War I, the Nazis argue, not because we are inferior, but because we were betrayed by our leaders or betrayed by outsiders within. Dissidents, Jews, others who are seen as polluting the German population. This is the rhetoric, this is the anti-Semitism, this is the exclusionary message that comes along with this inclusionary appeal to the great German nation and patriotism. Again, the Nazi Party was founded by those who fought in the Great War, people like Adolf Hitler, who have their own personal trauma. Why did we lose? Why didn't we achieve this great victory? Why must we now accept this continuing punishment that comes again as a consequence of the Paris Peace Conference? Well, the answer to that could be the war was stupid and foolish and a great tragedy for humanity. But if you believe that, then a lot of your belief system collapses. Instead, you find a scapegoat, or you blame the political order. You separate them from your sense of who is a real German. And that's what the Nazis did. They argued that the problem isn't the German nation, the German people. They are superior, they are great, and made those appeals again to inclusion. The problem is we are betrayed by our leaders, or we've allowed German society to be populated by inferior types who destroyed our will or pitted us against each other. That was the argument of the early founders of Nazism. And again, that nationalism was rekindled, that nationalism could be reclaimed. That was very appealing to people who suffered the trauma, misery, and despair that we enunciated on the first slide. And so it became very popular among veterans who could look to this ideology as an answer, an explanation for defeat, and a restoration of national pride, meaning and direction for themselves and for the nation. It provided easy scapegoats, people to blame. It provided, again, a pathway forward to revitalizing a German nation, rooted in that sense that we are superior, we are destined for greatness. And so the very people who were suffering a variety of miseries, whether they were economic, whether or not they were existential, or whether or not they were psychological, those people gravitated to this ideology, which said, we are superior, we are great, we will avenge the injustice of the Versailles Treaty, we will rise anew, we will create a Third Reich that will reign for 1,000 years. That restorative process and project was part of Nazism's appeal to, again, people who felt they had no hope, no direction, and often found themselves adrift in a vast sea. Then Nazism offered itself as also a pathway forward that could achieve real results, put people to work, revitalize the German state, reclaim those lands that were taken unjustly from us in the Versailles Treaty. It had an appealing messenger at the center, and that too is key in these revolutionary movements. One figurehead, one individual that can serve as a lightning rod for all of these energies, crystallize these various ambitions. People gravitated to Nazism for a variety of reasons. You're getting a personal anecdote, a personal telling of that in the Alphonse Heck book. And through the course of that book, you could understand why certain people would gravitate to Nazism, the appeal there. And there are millions of Germans, and they all have different backgrounds and experiences. There isn't just one reason why people embraced Hitler. Part of it was this idea that something must be done, and he offered himself as a person willing to do something. And he came in with a very aggressive agenda that he was willing to pursue. Also, he was very appealing and energetic and charismatic. The Nazis were very adroit at using mass media. Hitler had a film corps that surrounded him and produced propaganda movies that amplified his charisma and standing and made this very small man, in every sense of the word, something larger than he was. And when you feel as if there is no hope, when you feel as if you continue to suffer from injustice, when you feel as if the existing order is unresponsive or illegitimate, the idea of joining a movement that offers true change, very appealing. And so that helps to explain the origins and increasing appeal of Nazism in the 1920s in Germany. Okay, it doesn't take too much intellectual effort to see the obvious contradictions with Nazi ideology. No society is pure. There is no pure race, no pure nation. The idea of a pure Aryan race is an absolute fiction. It doesn't take too much effort to see the varieties of groups in the German nation and within the Nazi movement itself. So this idea of a pure race, this Aryan race, is nonsense. It's fiction. It required a lot of propaganda and deliberate efforts to conjure up some gauzy, imagined German past. Also, the idea of blaming everything on the Jews doesn't really make a lot of sense. They're a very small population within Germany. How could this small group be culpable, responsible for all the problems in German society? How could this small group of people somehow undermine the greatness of the German nation and German population? The Jews were often simultaneously described as super powerful but also super weak. Another one of the contradictions involved in the anti-Semitism that is at the heart of Nazism. Jews were described as both communists and capitalists. They're responsible for all our miseries because they control banking, finance, but also they want to overthrow capitalism and create a communist revolution. So the Nazi ideology is riddled with contradictions, and that begs the question, well, why did people believe this? Well, the question itself of why such a contradictory, flawed ideology could take root is first predicated on the idea that we expect things to be consistent, or we prize consistency as good, as superior. We often as well believe that people are convinced of things because they make sense. Well, that's not exactly true. Quite often, the most persuasive ideas and arguments are the ones that are often contradictory because they offer lots of different things to lots of different people. And also, the contradictions beg for, demand a labor, a work of resolution. If you start to see contradictions, well, that demands that one answer for those contradictions. And in doing so, that allows further ways of deepening, transmitting, explaining this ideology. Hey, this doesn't make sense. Well, let me make it make sense, right? So contradictions conjure up an intellectual labor or a persuasive labor to iron them out. Or they offer lots of different places for people to attach onto. And they don't really care if the other elements don't fit, don't make sense, because there is one piece of the puzzle that's very appealing to you. So we as historians, we as history students should not be content with simply punching holes into these noxious ideologies that we encounter and say, that doesn't make sense, it's not right. Well, first of all, we shouldn't imagine that everything is going to make sense, or imagine that simply because something is logical, therefore it's better or more persuasive. And it misses the point because contradiction is necessary. Racism doesn't make sense. It is inherently flawed if you approach it from a rational, logical point of view, and yet it persists. And efforts to dismantle it often serve to reinforce it. Nazism doesn't make sense. It is a flawed, terrible, odious way of explaining the world. But it persists because it is contradictory. As a contradiction, it offers lots of different things to lots of different people. As a contradiction, it demands reconciliation. It demands a labor of making sense. Let me explain it to you, and that only deepens the message. It only furthers the transmission. It only conjures up more propaganda. As I mentioned earlier with nationalism, it's not as if you're convinced of something once and then you never have to return to it again. Instead, these isms, these ideologies, demand constant vigilance, constant nurturing. And Nazism, often because of its contradictions, continued to testify to itself in an effort to persuade people, in an effort to iron over those contradictions. And another part of the way in which Nazism reconciles these obvious flaws, these obvious contradictions, is that Nazism in particular was anti-intellectual, anti-ideological. It was all about doing something, taking to the streets, taking action, arguing for action over ideas. Nazism was about force, it was about brutality, it was about violence, it was about punching and beating the hell out of people who disagree with you and forcing them either to shut up or simply eliminating them as a threat. Another part of the appeal of Nazism was its emphasis on force, its emphasis on action, its emphasis on violence. Violence targeting people who are seen to be not one of us, not a member of our group, threatening to our advance. Nazism emphasized the idea of conflict, arguing that conflict is natural and good because it coaxes out of you your higher reaches. It allows you to develop that inner Aryan greatness as you combat the people who are not one of us. It was anti-intellectual, arguing that thought, arguing that contemplation is weak. Intellectuals are weak. Instead, the strong do something. They take action. They are confident in their beliefs, and they bring their beliefs into action. Nazism is anti-intellectual. It's anti-contemplation. It's all about force, violence, coercive power, and not restraining one's firm belief in national greatness. Take to the streets. Force your will upon those who are imagined to not be worthy of us. And action is necessary because forces conspire against us, Nazis argue. There are these polluters within. There are these people who seek to stymie and limit our advance and development. And they name them the Jews, They cited them as scapegoats, and they tapped into that deep anti-Semitism. Those are the people who are responsible for your suffering. Those are the people who have limited and stymied our development. They're the people who conspired against us. Now go get them. That was also part of the appeal of Nazism. It offered itself as a remedy. It offered itself as a course of action. Follow me. I know the way forward. Those people are the threat. The Jews, the communists, the socialists, they're the people who we must get. And let's go get them. And again, tack back to our first slide. People feel angry, despondent. They feel as if the system is corrupt. They feel as if there is no legitimate pathway for change, that the system does not allow for change, and therefore the system has to be overthrown. And with that way of thinking, with that circumstance, violent action is indeed not only possible, but in the minds of those who become true believers, true adherents to this ideology, this plan, this program, absolutely necessary. We are recounting all of the necessary ingredients for radical transformation, in this case, in the form of Nazism in Germany. As we've seen earlier, quite often, one of the necessary ingredients in radical transformation is to have one figure who can really serve as a lightning rod, as a nexus point, a place where all of these different energies, enthusiasms, fears, conspiracies can crystallize. We saw that earlier with Lenin in the Russian Revolution. We'll see that again in lectures to come as we chart other revolutionary movements around the globe in the 20th century. In the case of this radical transformation, the rise of fascism in Germany, that one figure would be Adolf Hitler. Hitler wasn't German by birth. In fact, he was born in Austria. And there's a theory in history that those who often emerge as the most ardent nationalists, those who often become these demagogic figures who see themselves as the figures who will bring about the glory of a great nation, they're often outsiders. It's the case with Napoleon, who wasn't French by birth. It's the case with Joseph Stalin, who we'll talk about later in the class, who was born in Georgia but would become a leader of the Soviet Union. And because of this outsider status and their consciousness of it, they often seek to really again establish themselves as a member of the group they are aspiring to. And so it is often the case that the most nationalistic figures are often people who are outside the nation or have to work in this fashion to be seen as one of the members of the nation. Napoleon in France, Stalin in the Soviet Union, Hitler in Germany. He wasn't German by birth. He was Austrian. And a consciousness, an awareness of that outsider status is probably why he worked so diligently to stylize himself as the German, as the leader of this imagined German nation. Hitler fought in World War I, and this seems to have played a very causal role in his rise as the leader of the Nazi Party. He was one of the many German soldiers who felt betrayed, felt as if the German nation was denied a victory that was their just desert. Hitler believed very much in this idea of the German nation. He very much believed in this idea of the supremacy of, again, this imagined German community, and as a result, had to somehow reconcile Germany's humiliation, defeat during and after World War I. Well, that led him to the scapegoating, the targeting of people who he again saw as responsible for the misery he experienced and the misery that other veterans of the war who had loyally served the nation experienced, and the broader experience of the German people during and after the war. He quickly rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party and became its leader, owing to his charisma, his dogged determination, his willingness to separate himself from his rivals in the party. In 1923, he launched his first effort to topple the Weimar Republic. He was incarcerated in prison for that failed coup attempt, And there in prison, he wrote his magnum opus, Mein Kampf, which translates from the German as My Struggle. This, too, is often a factor in the place of revolutionaries in human history. They have a written document. They have a text that can circulate, influence, infect. We will see how other figures, other revolutionaries in the 20th century will work to write down their ideology, publish their own respective magnum opus, and do so in a way that will allow that idea to circulate beyond themselves to, again, as a written document, influence, infect around the globe. And Mein Kampf was avidly read by many around the globe, and many people were influenced by this way of thinking. So having a written text, having your ideas, your ideology written down is often instrumental to mobilizing a mass movement. In the 1920s, print was of great influence. Today, it would be a viral video or a meme on the internet or a posting on a message board. Having words, having a means to circulate those words, crucial for mobilizing a movement. And again, this is not singular to Hitler. It is, again, one of these necessary ingredients quite often in revolutionary movements. Mein Kampf is Hitler's statement regarding the responsibility of Jews for, again, all the miseries and ills of the German people. It is Hitler's magnum opus, but it is ultimately a testimony to anti-Semitism. It is a book that argues for, again, this idea of the racial purity, the racial supremacy of the German people, and drips, overflows with anti-Semitism. Interestingly, in Mein Kampf, Hitler has a lot of praise for the United States. He wrote it in 1924 at a time in which the eugenics movement was very visible in the United States, at a time, as we described in our most recent lecture, where the United States was enacting immigration restrictions that targeted people from Southern and Eastern Europe. In fact, the Johnson-Reed Act was passed in 1924, the same year that Mein Kampf was published. But in addition to his support for such immigration restrictions and anti-Semitism, Hitler in Mein Kampf singles out the United States and its racial policies, particularly its embrace of eugenics. Eugenics was sort of the next stage of scientific racism for intellectuals after social Darwinism, and it argued that some people have superior genes, others have inferior genes, and the United States was a hotbed of eugenics in the 1920s. Eugenics movements led to laws that forbid certain individuals from marrying others. Anti-miscegenation laws were passed in this country, in the United States, in the early 20th century that forbid whites from marrying African Americans, Latinos, Jews, Catholics. Hitler said that's wonderful because it was a way of preserving the superiority of the white race. Eugenics was, again, scientific racism. It was a false pseudo-scientific racism, much like social Darwinism. It led to those anti-miscegenation laws that were based on this idea that whites are inherently superior. And Hitler heaped praise on American eugenicists. But also, eugenics led to laws that, in this country, the United States, ultimately resulted in sterilization. Between 1907 and 1963, when the last of these laws were still on the books, over 64,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized by their government. That's what happened in this country in the early 20th century. It certainly was growing and a major movement in America in 1924, and Hitler singled that out for praise. Now, of course, the Nazis will come to power and they will embark on their own genocide, the Holocaust. They will murder 6 million people in their idea of creating a master race. And the Holocaust and all of the evil efforts of the Nazis to exterminate people is often seen as a singular event, an event that comes out of this radical transformation in Germany fueled by anti-Semitism. But it's important to note that Hitler does not operate in a vacuum, that there were other similar movements in the United States in the case of eugenics that believed in this idea of a pure race and used measures in law like forcible sterilization that reflected that, and you could see it right there in the pages of Mein Kampf. I don't urge you to see it there, but it's there. So Mein Kampf features in it Hitler heaping this praise on the United States for its racist policies, for its eugenics policies that would lead to the forcible sterilization of tens of thousands of Americans. And then later, of course, Hitler comes to power and he embarks on his own effort of racial purity through the genocide, slaughter of the Holocaust and World War II. Mein Kampf was Hitler's magnum opus, his treatise, and it became a huge influence on those who read it as they swelled the ranks of his movement. So you have an outsider looking to be accepted within. You have an angry, disgruntled individual who plots against the legitimate government of Germany. You have a written text, Mein Kampf, which articulates and expresses this call to action, the scapegoating of individuals, and this imagined world of racial purity. And then you have Hitler's charisma, his ability to tap into modern media and different forms of communication, his energy. He was in many ways a personification of the Nazi commitment to force, aggression, and for, again, people in despair and despondency who felt as if there was no recourse, he offered himself as that recourse. He offered meaning, identity, join with us, to a group of people who felt as if they were indeed adrift in a vast sea. Hitler skillfully employed modern media. His rise, the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 20s and 30s, is another cautionary tale regarding the new forms of communication that developed in the 20th and now 21st century. Film, radio, certainly in the 20s and 30s, those were the mediums employed by Hitler. But of course, later in the 20th century, television and now the internet can be sources for promulgating and advancing odious, terrible, noxious ideologies. Hitler had his own group of filmmakers who he worked with closely to craft these images. He held rallies, massive rallies, that seemed to communicate visually this idea of the tribe, the group, the Volk, be one of us. He was performative in his gestures, in his rhetoric, and then he encouraged others to act out according to this ideology. Take to the streets, be one of us. There were events to be had, book burnings, targeting of individuals, violence, bloodshed in the streets, and you could be part of it. He offered that to people who, again, found themselves adrift without meaning and purpose. In 1933, members of the ruling elite in Germany reconciled themselves to the rise of this demagogue and appointed him chancellor. Hitler had now risen to this place of prominence in the German government where he could now go forward and consolidate his power. His appointment as chancellor was imagined to be conciliatory, give him a role and position within the government. But, as we'll talk about in a moment, he used that role to remove, purge anyone who wasn't of his movement and loyal to his rise and regime. So, here we tell something that's particularly peculiar to the rise of fascism in Germany, this way in which, ultimately, those in power worked in concert with Hitler, and the movement shifted in a way that folded in the industrial class. Fascism was a rising movement, but also rising in Germany, communism. By 1932, the year before Hitler's installation as chancellor, The communists had made major gains in the German parliament, and their only rival seemingly were the fascists under Hitler's leadership. And that urged the elite class in German society, the Junker establishment, those who were prominent figures in the German military, industrialists, to cast their lot with Hitler. They feared the communists, and they reconciled themselves to saying, well, Hitler's a menace and threat, but the communists are worse. This was particularly true for industrialists who saw in communism the loss of property and power of that revolutionary movement. With Hitler, they could hold on to their property, power, and wealth if they cast their lot with him. And so, though, again, very early on, Nazism offered critiques of the rich, that critique was often a reflection of the true core of Nazism, anti-Semitism. And when it became convenient, they quickly jettisoned their anti-business, anti-capitalist rhetoric as the marriage of powers consolidated here. Hitler needed the industrialists, and the industrialists needed Hitler. Hitler needed the Junker because of their established place as power brokers in German society. And they needed Hitler, in their mind, to protect them from the only other possible alternative, communism. There was a growing sense in the early 30s in Germany that the Weimar Republic is doomed, that a revolution is imminent, and it's either Hitler or the communists. And if you're a wealthy industrialist, Hitler provides a preferable alternative because you maintain your factory, you maintain your power. If you are in the German army, a general in the German army, Hitler is a much more appealing option than a communist revolution. And so you get this marriage of powers. 4 weeks after Hitler was installed as chancellor, a fire broke out in the German parliament, the Reichstag. Hitler quickly moved to blame the fire on communists, saying that the German Republic was under attack. The Reichstag fire would be a convenient foil for the Nazi regime to launch their effort to purge the government of people who are seen as disloyal. When the Reichstag busts into flames, Hitler immediately blames the communists and says, as a result, the German nation is under attack and we must take emergency measures to protect the German nation, which really offered him a chance to consolidate his control. He banned the Communist Party, banned all parties except the Nazis. With this, the marriage of power continues, and the elite, the Junkers, side with Hitler as their protector from what is seen as an imminent communist overthrow. And Nazism is purged of its anti-capitalist rhetoric, its anti-big business rhetoric. Instead, now the industrialists and the capitalists join with Hitler, as Hitler argues that the nation is imperiled, endangered. This too is, of course, important in not only the study of the rise of Nazism in Germany, but such radical transformations, an enemy who is now manifest in this attack, who we must safeguard the nation from. And fearing that enemy, imagined or real, you have this consolidation of powers and very clear evidence that the Nazis are not socialist. The Reichstag fire, the way in which Hitler would offer himself as the only solution, the only remedy to protecting Germany, the way in which the Junker elite side with Hitler, all serves to now solidify and end this Nazi takeover of Germany. Hitler seizes power, he purges the German government and bureaucracy of anyone who will not pledge their absolute loyalty to his movement. This is part of Nazism, this idea that it's us versus them, that the them They are enemies of our progress and greatness, and therefore they must be eliminated. Well, Hitler put that into practice with the incarceration or murder of people who would not pledge their loyalty to his movement. And now Hitler is the power, the government in Germany. Now there are no other alternatives. The revolution solidified in this absolute rule, this control over the German state by the Nazi regime and Nazi party. Hitler, as he offered himself as an alternative to communist revolution, as he promised to revitalize the greatness of the German nation, expands his appeal and grows his base of support. We rightfully see the Nazis as evil. In fact, they are the ultimate metaphor for evil. We should really broaden our metaphors, incorporate other examples of evil, as there are many. One we just talked about, eugenics, right? But it seems like we always fall upon the Nazis as the ultimate manifestation of evil, and it's true. They are very, very, very evil, a good manifestation of evil for us to cite, but they're not the only one. But when we often see Nazism through this lens of evil, we lose sight of the way in which the people who participate in this movement, who supported this movement, they're not marching around every day saying, we're the assholes of history, right? We're these evil marauders. They thought of themselves as doing the good, noble thing. They thought of themselves as part of a movement that was dedicated to national greatness, and as a result, they joined in the Nazi movement. You are reading Alphonse Heck's memoir of what it was like to be a young boy growing up in Germany. And you can see the way in which Nazism appealed to him and how many ordinary Germans could be swept up in this. So the people who joined this movement were shopkeepers and librarians and teachers and architects. They weren't caricatures of evil. They weren't walking around with pitchforks. They weren't what we often conjure up when we think of Nazism. This is the term that Hannah Arendt, one of the historians of Nazi Germany, called the banality of evil. That evil often appears in very banal forms. It's the neighbor, it's the shopkeeper, it's the teacher. It's these ordinary people who were capable of doing extraordinary evil. That's part of the lesson of this class. Evil is done not by people who are walking around with a t-shirt saying, I'm Mr. Evil, right? Evil is done on a very banal scale every day. It's done by ordinary people. It's done by people who, again, don't fit our archetype of evil. And in Nazi Germany, 12-year-old boys like Alphonse Heck, shopkeepers, middle class, educated people, were part of this regime. So we should not just reduce it to caricature, and we should not see it as solely manifest in the major figureheads like Adolf Hitler. It was a broad movement that appealed to many people for the reasons we've enunciated here. It was a swelling movement that folded into it so many people from many different walks of life. Hitler now controls Germany, and he takes action. He takes bold, aggressive action to violate the Versailles Treaty. He pays off on his rhetoric, and he begins to rapidly rearm the German nation in open violation of the Versailles Treaty, building up the German army and navy. This was part of his idea to restore the glory and might of Germany, to avenge the injustice of the Versailles Treaty. It was as part of his plan to put people to work, people in factories making tanks, planes, building up the arsenal that he will soon unleash in World War II. As a result, people say he succeeded, and this only furthers the support for his movement. People are working. The Depression is over. The national malaise has been remedied. He also pays off his rhetoric by targeting the people he blamed for limiting, retarding, stymieing the greatness of the German people. He begins to confiscate property. He begins to close businesses. He begins to require members of the Jewish community to wear a star, an emblem on their clothing identifying them as Jewish. A slow but steady process of marginalization, a slow but steady process of mobilizing to target this community that will later, of course, lead to the Holocaust. And so Hitler comes to power and he takes the action that he spoke of, that he demanded in his rhetoric. Hitler has come to power. He is openly violating the Versailles Treaty. He is building up a war machine. He will soon come to power and invade parts of Europe that he claims are rightfully part of the German homeland, and then soon he will begin to invade sovereign nations, setting in motion the events in Europe that will eventually burn into the inferno of World War II. Initially, he argues, I'm just merely righting a historical wrong. I am simply finding justice out of the injustice of the Versailles Treaty. When he invades certain parts of Germany, he claims those are German people. They speak German, and they want to be part of the German nation. And there's hope in certain parts of Europe and around the world that Hitler will be satisfied with simply reclaiming the land lost by Germany in the Versailles Treaty. But as we know, he won't be content with simply reclaiming those lands. He will soon seek to dominate and control all of Europe. So, by the mid-30s, Hitler has clearly revealed himself as a bellicose, aggressive threat to the existing order that followed World War I. There is hope among some that this will prevent and ultimately not lead to a future conflict. But of course, we sit here with hindsight and see instead the beginnings of what will be World War II. Let's end by here in one slide comparing and contrasting these two radical revolutionary movements that we have now so far examined in the class. We've been doing this throughout the lecture, but here we will, in summary, compare the radical transformation that occurred in Russia with the fall of a traditional society and the rise of a communist state, with what we've examined in this lecture, the fall of a liberal government, the Weimar Republic, and the rise of a fascist state in Germany. Some similarities. Well, both were anti-liberal. Hitler identified the Weimar Republic as the enemy, and the Bolsheviks identified the provisional government also as the enemy, the obstacle to their plan going forward. They consolidated power, they eliminated their enemies, they invalidated any other form of political expression, totalitarian one-party regimes headed by that one charismatic individual who demanded loyalty and crystallized the various energies, enthusiasms, hopes, and fears that led to the rise of these radical movements. They enforced their rule through violence, terrorism, and intimidation. They had at their command the guns, the coercive power of the state, and they are willing to use it against enemies, ideological enemies, political enemies, or, in the case of Nazi Germany, religious, ethnic groups identified by the state as unfit, inferior. Both of these movements were, to some extent, driven by ideology, certainly more so in the case of the communist revolution in Russia, rooted in, again, an intellectual tradition that stretches back to the 19th century and Marxism. And Nazism was less ideological, but as we said here, there is a body of beliefs associated with race, nation, blood. But also central to Nazism was the idea of putting those beliefs into action. That idea of the struggle, the fight, that might makes right, that stopping, thinking, contemplation is a sign of weakness and betrayal to the nation. They both have scapegoats. For the Bolsheviks, it was the provisional government or the landed elite or those still dedicated to the monarchy. For Hitler, it's the Jews. It's these enemies that he identified within. However, there are some key differences. The sense of us, the solidarity, the group that we are fighting for and seeking to advance the progress of, for fascists, the idea of the Aryan race, the superior German race. For the Bolsheviks, it was class ideology, at least in rhetoric, not in practice. Fascism, rather than topple the elites, folded them into their movement. The Junker elite, the bureaucrats, the army officials, the industrialists, and ultimately became pro-capitalists rather than anti-capitalists. Communism focused again on class, on the proletariat. It toppled those elites, and ultimately, again, in ideology and to some extent in actuality, was anti-capitalist. So some similarities, some differences. We have now traced yet another radical revolution with the consolidation of control in Germany. There is another way of organizing humanity in the 20th century, and fascism had many 20th century elements to it, alongside liberalism, traditional societies, and communism. We have certainly foreshadowed where we are going in lectures to come, as so much of this will come to a head soon, as once again the world will go to war in the 20th century.